This video is looking at the movement analysis of the wrist joint. So we're looking at what movements happen at the wrist and what muscles cause those movements. So the wrist is able to do flexion and extension in the sagittal plane and abduction and adduction in the frontal plane. It cannot rotate in the transverse plane. So beware with the screwdriver movement that you might do, like perhaps in table tennis, putting spin on the ball. That is not the wrist. That is the radial on the joint. So you need to know what wrist flexion and extension looks like or is, but also the muscles that cause this movement. Flexion and extension. So wrist flexion. Let me actually do extension first. Wrist extension. If you are shooting in basketball, you would cock your hand backwards, have the ball sat on top of it. That is wrist extension. If you bend forward and put your hands flat on the floor, that is wrist extension. So it's that pulling your hand backwards on top of your forearm, increasing the angle at the joint. So you can see the joint angle here is increased in wrist extension. So nice easy bit with this movement is that the muscles that cause this movement are wrist extensors. So wrist extension is called by wrist extensors. So you can see this image here. This is the top, the superior part of your forearm, and in order to pull your hand backwards and cock your wrist extensors need to contract. They are the agonists for wrist extension, and while they're contracting, the wrist flexors need to be relaxed and lengthening to allow that movement to happen. When you shoot your basketball, so the ball leaves your hand, you flick your wrist forward, that is wrist flexion. That is wrist flexion, and that's when the angle at the joint, angle at the wrist joint is reduced. So logically, in order to pull your hand underneath your forearm, you need the muscles to be on the underside, the inferior side of your forearm. And you can see over here that this is the inferior side of the forearm. These are your wrist flexors. So when they contract, all of these tendons pull on your hand and your fingers, and you pull your hand back underneath your forearm. That is wrist flexion. So nice and easy. I think the most difficult bit is to recognize what is wrist flexion, what is wrist extension. So wrist extension is almost like cocking your hand so you look at your watch. Wrist flexion is waving somebody goodbye, putting your hand forward to flick the basketball away from you. And they're caused by wrist extensors or wrist flexors. So here's a larger diagram for you to have a look at. The last pair of movements that you need to know about the wrist are wrist abduction and adduction. The nice thing is that you don't need to know the muscles that cause this, but you do need to know what wrist abduction and adduction is. So from a neutral position, let's say the hand was in a straight line down the arm. If you move your hand away from the midline a bit, so almost cock your hand sideways, laterally, this is wrist abduction. Wrist adduction, as you can just about see from this diagram, is where the hand is moved in the frontal plane towards the body's midline. So moving your hand away from the body's midline or towards the body's midline. Abduction, adduction happen in the frontal plane. And again, you do not need to know muscles that cause this movement.